Friday night, the amount of drummers, for those of you who have tickets, your peer mentors or professors have them for you.
Amount of drummers tomorrow, this afternoon, a really, really good round table. Unfortunately, Dr. Morrison can't be with us this afternoon, but we have a special treat for you that last year was really, really, really well received. So do come. Let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Amanda Martinez Morrison, PhD from UT Austin in Cultural Anthropology. She is a faculty member in our Department of Chicano and Latino Studies and does all kinds of interesting research in areas of Chicano and Latino identities as they play out, especially in popular culture. She has published articles about music, hip-hop, so-called chick lit in Mexican-American context, all kinds of really, really cool stuff. She's won a number of research fellowships and is very active as a public intellectual, working in public organizing and writing and editing for a number of popular press periodicals. Please offer a warm and welcome to Dr. Amanda Morrison.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Oh, there we go. Thank you. It's good to be here. I really enjoy giving this lecture. I've done it several years in a row because it touches on a lot of my interests as well. I'm actually I'm a former lecturer in CALS, AMCS, cultural anthropology here. And I'm working at SRJC, our junior college, running a multicultural center there. I mean, all these issues around identity, race, ethnicity, culture, pop culture are near and dear to my heart. Junot Diaz's novel really captures a lot of that. And gender as well. So that's the focus, looking a little bit about at masculinity, embodied in the characters, in this issue of cultural hybridity, as well as race. We'll talk about race a lot today. I don't know, I kind of like to use this time with you to give some context for this novel. I love this novel. There's some things about it that are confusing maybe. And you know, the other thing is that, where's the novel set? New Jersey, right? Has anyone here ever been to New Jersey? Raise your hand. So a few. Impressions? I've never been to Jersey. I've driven through it on a bus on my way to Philly or something. New York, I don't know. Impressions of New Jersey? You're like, I just saw it in a car too. Well, I mean, that's the thing about us Californians. We're really regionally centric too. We're kind of myopic oftentimes, I find myself included, in our understanding of regional differences in the United States. I have a colleague now at SRJC who is from Connecticut, from New Haven. And he's from like a really urban, like New Haven in a working class black neighborhood. He's African American himself, and he taught at a college there, a junior college that was like, he said it was like 35% African American, and then he came here, and there's like so few black folks in Sonoma County, so that's already really difficult and alienating. And then he also finds that Californians don't understand the specific racial dynamics or identity issues and immigration patterns of the East Coast, and kind of vice versa. One big difference is that who is the largest national origin group of Latinos in the United States as a whole? From what country do most US Latinos come from? Does anyone know? Oh, you might be intuiting it. It's Mexico, for sure, by far. Although the settlement of Mexican Americans in the East Coast is kind of a newer phenomenon. So in the East Coast, the orientation, so for folks who live out there, when you think of Latinidad or Latinos, Latinx, whatever the term is that you prefer, they often think of what national origin group? Anyone know? So what's the most common kind of national origin grouping on the East Coast, like a city like New York? Yeah, Puerto Ricans. And then that's interesting because are Puerto Ricans, I mean, Puerto Rico is a state, or it's a commonwealth, right? It's part of the US, so Puerto Ricans are citizens. So we got into all that stuff around because of the horrible storms there, the hurricanes. And like a lot of Americans are treating Puerto Ricans as if they're not Americans. We're kind of like, oh, that island over there, right? So it's just a very different context that you're reading through that I think for a lot of us as Californians, we're kind of like, it's not fully maybe landing right away. So this is the kind of, and then Junot Diaz uses interesting regional terminology in addition to a lot of other slang, including the N-word, right? Which we could talk about. So regionally, he uses this slang, refers to Dominican Americans or Dominicans living in, let's say, the New York metro region as doyos. It's kind of, he's got a lot of infused hip hop slang. So Dominican Americans living in, and so the way I frame it is like the landscape we're looking at, the setting, when they're in the US, obviously the characters go to the Dominican Republic, is this New York metro area, and I kind of am including New Jersey in there, Paterson, New Jersey, and other parts of urban New Jersey, right? So this New York metro area, kind of like you would say the LA metro area or the Bay Area metro area, right? He also refers to Puerto Ricans. Did any of you catch this? Puerto Ricans living in New York as Puerto Rocks. Puerto Rocks. So there's all this interesting slang that's probably not familiar to most of us. So let's think about what is the specificity of Dominicanos in the United States, right? I had to do a brainstorm too. I can't say I know very many Dominican Americans. As a very dyed in the wool California girl, Chicana from, LA and the Bay. So then I was brainstorming stuff, like maybe some figures that we would all know about, who are of Dominican descent, who are celebrities today, or well-known figures. Can you think of any? These are mine. And sometimes you don't know. It's not like people say it, really obviously in their public or celebrity lives. So Zoe Saldana, Aaron Rodriguez, Michelle Rodriguez, Sammy Sosa. So there's some athletes, right? Especially baseball, because baseball is huge in the DR. I always joke about that. I conclude that picture with Sammy Sosa because there's something going on with his whitening. And so I'm always like, yeah, he's got the fuku. The curse, the fuku. That's a very important theme in this book, right? There's some fuku going on with Sammy Sosa. That's Junot Diaz himself who has emerged as definitely one of our most significant public intellectuals. I'm actually wanting you to see kind of like a visual of what the kind of range of what Dominicanos look like, because it's not quite as simple as Latino, Black. That's what I want to talk about. Now we have Cardi B. I keep hearing about this lady. She seems to have made an impact in the last, year or two? Yeah? What do you think? Any? I don't know, actually, I can't say I know that, but I'm getting old, I don't know. Why has Cardi B made such a big splash? Raise your hand if you've heard of her. Okay. So you just don't want to say anything. That's all right. I mean, because people, sometimes it's a matter of taste. Like, some of you might be like, oh, no. And some of you might be like, yeah, she's amazing or really interesting, right? I don't know what to make of it yet. Obviously, she talks about her kind of hustle as a stripper and all that. So there's a lot of issues around. I'm sure a lot of, conventional feminists would, that's hard to stomach to some extent for some folks and some ways of thinking. I have students who are like, no, she's empowered. She's a hustler. Anyway, I kind of just wanted to create this visual and then ask this question, which I bet no one will want to answer. I bet I'll get crickets too. Do you consider these celebrities Black? Do you consider these folks African American or Black? And that's not an obvious answer. And especially if you're not familiar with the kind of historic experiences and the way Afro-Latinos or Latinos who don't identify with any African ancestry are kind of positioned racially and how their experiences are different here in the States than they might be in in Latin American countries. It actually is a really complex identity to hold, given the racial hierarchy and structures that we've inherited in the US. So the other question is Oscar Black? So in the novel, it's actually, I haven't read the novel for it's been a minute. Well, I don't know how far you are in the novel yet. Does anyone recall, how far are you? You don't even want to talk about that. Okay. Syllabus-wise, you're roughly halfway. And I can't recall if the characters who are of Dominican descent living in Patterson identify overtly as Black. I don't recall that being a real kind of overt identification, but it's definitely an implied exploration in the characters. So the question is Oscar Black? And so I'll just leave it as a question, actually, and give some more context. So I noticed, I don't know if you have, well, any takeaways? If there's any takeaways from video, you're welcome to chime in. Yes, Kim. Hi. Yeah. To her son, she's, yeah. Right. So Belly is darker. Is she darker skinned than her sisters? Is that, yeah. Like there was this sister, yeah, in that family. I think that's something I'm more and more interested, or it seems pertinent among your generation is the way, is colorism in Latinx communities. I mean, yes, white supremacy is, but how does white supremacy play out in the way Latinos think of their African American brothers and sisters, of Blackness in general? There's some shadow there. There's definitely a fair amount of racism in Latino communities. And so we could frame that as Fuku. Fuku being the curse of, the kind of curse, or I think what Junot Diaz is trying to do with that is it's the legacy, it's the shadow, it's the ghosts of a very violent, genocidal history of a transatlantic slave trade and genocide of Native Americans and all that. So Fuku is the lasting feeling of that we're not always conscious of. But it plays out when a mother tells her daughter, "You're black, and the implication is you're not as beautiful as your sister." So it comes up in Latino communities too. Anyone catch this? Does anyone watch Love and Hip Hop Miami? Yeah. Have you caught what's going on with what's Amara La Negra? Can you say what happened? Young Hollywood. Do you want to watch the clip? Should we? Yeah, let's do it. So if you clip on, yeah, but thank you. That's a great overview. Yeah. I think she's amazing. Speaking truth to power. It's a trip that young Hollywood himself is Latino. So it's not the kind of most obvious kind of interaction when we think of racism, white supremacy. I mean, it does have to do with white supremacy, but it's the way that Latinos themselves or communities of color have actually internalized white supremacy to the point where he cannot even, I mean, for his thinking is all commercial interests, he's thinking he cannot package her blackness. right? He says something about, and the sad thing is there's some truth in that as far as what the market is accepting right now. For an Afro-Latino, Latina in, even like what she seems to be trying to break into the Latin music, like probably a lot of the Spanish language music scene, and black folks there are rejected to a quite large extent. And then in the English language pop music scene, there's also like, well, are you black or are you Latino? We can't, like that's impossible to comprehend, that the complexity of our identities, right? So I think that's what folks of Dominican descent, especially folks with African ancestry where you can see phenotypically features that we associate with blackness. Maybe they're very proud of their blackness, or some people don't claim it, but it's a very complex identity to navigate and occupy, especially in the United States, because we just have thought of things in very simplistic terms as black or white. So the truth is, historically, I think one of the best words to help us think through, black identity in the Americas or throughout the world is diaspora, right? So Afro-diasporic forms are cultural forms, identities, histories that, stem back to Africa, and typically what we're talking about is the displacement and the violence that occurred because of the transatlantic slave trade, which was unlike anything human history had ever seen before. Yes, there's been other forms of slavery throughout human history, but not like that. Not that systematic, not that widespread, not that cruel, not that punishing, not that, not where a whole group of humans were for all time deemed property, non-human. So the consequences of that is the spreading of people of African ancestry through the slave trade throughout the globe. And here in the Americas, you've got to think about it not as just the ancestry of African Americans. The kind of typical picture is an African American, elders in the South, going back, slave trade, folks who were enslaved are ancestors, and then maybe migrated to the North. But you also have to think about, especially Caribbean countries, so Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, not a country, but because that's where the sugar plantations were, and sugar was part of the triangular trade, which is a massive global capitalism 1.0. So back in the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s, you had that triangular trade you may have heard about, where it was like the cash crop, which in this case sugar was produced here. It was sent to the industrial north to process into a product like rum. And then the third piece of the triangle is Africa, the free labor that was extracted out of African people to process and pick the sugar, to deal with the sugar cane. It's the same with cotton. So that massive system has led to a population of folks of African ancestry all over the Americas, including the US. Did you guys watch this? So yes or no? No, okay. It's interesting, if you want to check it out, Skip Gates, who's one of the preeminent African American studies scholars, he did this cool series on what it's like to be black in Latin America. And when he goes to the DR, when he goes to the Dominican Republic, which neighbors and shares the island with Haiti. So Haiti, the big contrast is Haiti is the only nation in the history of humankind that was like it was founded as a slave revolt, and it was an explicitly black-led nation, and has received a lot of pushback because of the kind of black liberation politics at the root of their national identity. And then on the other side, on the DR, you also have a lot of people of African ancestry, but there's a sense that is explored in this documentary that they're not willing to kind of, a lot of Dominicanos are not willing to kind of own up to or be honest about or kind of embody their blackness because of internalized racism. So there's some really interesting exploration of that specifically in the Black and Latin America series. So we're dealing with two ways of conceptualizing race. The reason why young Hollywood is standing there like not able to, he doesn't even know Afro-Latino or Afro-Latina is like, huh? Like he can't even conceive of it. And it seems to be that is a result of the way we've historically conceived of race in very simplistic binary terms in the US, which is black and white. So whenever we talk about the race problem or race relations or whatever, it's usually kind of think of white oppressor, black victim or activist, which is true. But then there's all the other complexities of race in America, as you know, which is where do Latinos fit in this? Where do Asian Americans fit in this? And then if you're Afro-Latino, like it leaves out a lot in our conceptual ability to kind of conceptualize what it's like to be racialized in the United States. Because, so these are all, in Latin America it's different. There's like this profusion of terms, some of them kind of slang terms, some of them old colonial terms. So you're coming across these in Junot Diaz in his work, especially the slangy ones. I'm not totally familiar with all of them either. There's just a lot of different, the way race was conceived of in pretty much all Latin American nations was in terms of varying levels of being mixed, okay? So it's called Mestizaje, which I'll talk about in a second. So, and it's not like they're not racist down there. Definitely a lot of racism in Latin America. But there's more of an acknowledgement that people don't fall into like a binary either or, black or white, right? There's more than two categories, to put it simply. Whereas in the United States, it's mostly, yeah, this black-white issue. And then, so what that leaves out in white, like, do you learn in your history classes that Mexicans and Mexican Americans were also lynched in Texas? Not at the same rates as African Americans, especially in the South, but in southern states like Texas, former Confederate states, the same kinds of Jim Crow, you could call it Juan Crow, laws were applied to people of Mexican descent. Same fears of lynching, but we don't often learn that because it kind of just isn't it's not on our radar, that there are these very parallel experiences between Latinos and African Americans. It's just not part of the way we tell the story of America. So maybe that story is changing. So mestizaje, it's from the Spanish verb mezclar, to mix. And it's problematic, but interesting. Historically, it's the word used in Latin American nations to refer to this long-standing, so a 500-year plus process that occurred from 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, basically when the first Spaniards came to the Americas and all that historic violence and death occurred. The process of mixing, that was less policed in Latin America under the Spanish colonial empire than here in the United States in our original 13 colonies under the English colonial empire. So you did have more, also the same kind of sexual violence, the raping systematically of women of color was happening throughout the Americas, but there was also a little less policing of like sex or relationships between Europeans and indigenous folks and or folks of African ancestry. The thing to keep in mind though, like sometimes for me, if you haven't noticed, like you're probably thinking like, what am I? Like I'm kind of racially ambiguous too, like the way I look, and I'm aware of that, and it's part of who I am. My mom is Chicana, my mom's Mexican American, my dad's white, and I'm not even totally fluent in Spanish, so I definitely feel like I've definitely felt like a very mixed person with kind of neither here nor there a lot of my life. So sometimes I will claim like a mestiza identity because I really do experience my identity as mixed, as not one thing or the other. But there is this legacy, before we kind of start using mestizo, mestiza really nicely and freely, we have to recognize that the impetus in Latin America to mix was always about not just mixing so we can create some nice olive-toned race and not have any divisions anymore. It wasn't that nice or pretty. It was like, how do we incorporate former slaves and Native Americans into the dominant culture, which is the wider European, culture, and literally words emerged that were like blanqueamiento, or mejorar la raza, which literally meant like, so folks of color in Latin America had this message they received that you got to marry someone and have babies with someone who's light skinned. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. It was a message, a white supremacist message to folks of color in Latin America to whiten your family, to get closer to Europeanness or whiteness. So it's not without a racial hierarchy here. But at the same time, I don't know, this notion of mixing or being hybrid is relevant. And then I like to, so they're related to my mind. This other idea is cultural hybridity. So I think that helps in understanding Oscar's world, Junior's world, Lola and Belly's world, Junot Diaz's world, as very hybrid, so mixed, culturally mixed, right? Because cultural hybridity, I think, is a more hopeful kind of concept in my mind, which is where humans don't stay on either side of walls very neatly. You feel me? We can build them, but humans find ways to go under, to go over. If they're metaphorical walls, or we're literally looking at building more walls between the US and Mexico. But the US and Mexico, for example, the relationship between those two nations is deep, it's long-standing, it's fraught, it's complex, but it is not separate. Our histories are very chained together. And so the culture that comes out of that kind of contact, which humans always do, anthropologically it's just a fact that humans don't stay put, they move. That can be some exciting terrain, if you ask me. And I think that that's what the Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde is also demonstrating, this incredibly rich, hybrid, culturally hybrid world, led by Afro-Latino characters on the East Coast. So the mezcla or mix that we're looking at in this novel is the greater New York area. And I have another collage for you. And a lot of it involves, conceptually for our purposes, we're incorporating urban working class New Jersey, cities like Paterson and Newark. But the neighborhoods I really think of a lot as far as these very hybrid cultural spaces is the Bronx, the borough in New York, and Harlem. But New Jersey as well. There's just amazing, beautiful history that Junot Diaz is inheriting, tapping into, aware of, mining, of these kind of, for shorthand, kind of a black and brown fusion, right? This Afro-Latino fusion, because like in Harlem and the South Bronx is where hip-hop culture, that's the birthplace of hip-hop culture, the South Bronx. But it's also an area where a lot of Puerto Ricans live and have for generations now. And in fact, Puerto Ricans, like the members of the Rocksteady crew, were one of the innovators of b-boying, b-girling, breakdancing as it was known. And they were almost all Puerto Rican kids who might or might not have identified as Afro-Latino or black. But even before that, you have the Harlem Renaissance. You have really rich, beautiful, intellectual and artistic cultural output coming from these neighborhoods, Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance in the early 20th century, so much where jazz as a musical form crystallized and developed. Even more recently, the other thing to remember is that this is, I had to learn this some years ago too. You know, raise your hand if you've heard of the music salsa? Salsa music? Where's salsa from? Anyone know? It's kind of a trick question. Salsa, which a lot of people think of as just like the most kind of one of the most well-known styles of Latin music, it's actually from New York. It's from the Bronx and Harlem. It was created to a great extent by working class Puerto Ricans, many of whom did identify in some ways as Afro-Latino. And so it had this really gritty kind of vibe that was emerging right at the same time as hip hop. So there's a whole, and then Lin-Manuel Miranda's first well-known Broadway play before Hamilton was called In the Heights. I also recommend maybe watching, I think there's probably a movie version of it, or if it gets restaged. He sets the whole piece in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, where a lot of Dominicanos live. There's a big settlement of Dominicanos there. So it's, just think of all these kind of intertwined spaces where folks are getting together and creating cultures like salsa, like hip hop, like jazz, right? Oops, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. The other sort of trope, I think that's at play here, so this is now looking at, intersectionally we're looking at race but also gender, is stuff around being a man and masculinity. So watch for that too. I get the impression a lot of you aren't too deep into the novel yet. Don't sleep on this one. It's a good one. So there is this trope that you're probably aware of. I don't know, the Latin lover. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the trope of the Latin lover or the stereotype. No? You're not aware that Latino men are reputed or imbued with legendary prowess among women? It's funny because, I mean, like Latino men are like, yeah, I'll take that one, whatever. It's a stereotype for sure. It's a stereotype that's long existing because it's been reinforced over generations and generations through our popular culture, through U.S. popular culture, but also hemispheric popular culture. So when I thought of a Latin lover, I had these are way kind of older ones. Ricky Martin. That's an interesting case study. Ricky Martin. Chime in here if anyone wants to say anything. Like, does anyone remember what Ricky Martin's story was? Why don't we, where'd he go? What happened? It was a little bit before your time, a lot of you, huh? I forget how. Y'all were born in like the 90s, right? Or not even, oh my God. 2000, huh? Huh? 90s? Okay, you're 90s, barely, right? Yeah. You'll see how it is. All this time just gets squished. But Ricky Martin was definitely, in a way that young Hollywood was trying to mold rather forcibly and insultingly Amara into a cookie cutter package. That's exactly what the music industry or our cultural industries, our corporate cultural industries, processed Ricky Martin that way too. They made so much of him swiveling his hips and wearing his tight pants. And part of that is who he really is, right, as a central person. But the part they left out that he was not allowed to express was what? He's gay. So this is a very heteronormative stereotype or trope of the Latin lover being a heterosexual, sexy, handsome, seductive figure, Latino. So I think Ricky Martin was really quite victimized by that kind of cultural processing, corporate processing, and to the extent that he could not be out and be who he actually is as a man. And then when he did come out, that was a really brave thing in my book, because he was basically rejecting an entire commercial machine that was profiting him, but that was not sitting well with him. Who would you say, come on, like Sofia Vergara, a lot of people cite her as like she fits into a stereotype of the kind of spitfire, hot tamale Latina. Can you think of anyone today who's like really mining that stereotype of the Latin lover? Because these aren't very current, right? Anyone? For men though, Latin lover men. No? Okay. Well, interestingly, what I noticed in the music industry was specifically Dominicano artists a few years ago. We're hot, right? Okay, raise your hand if you've ever heard of Romeo Santos. Barely any of you. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Prince Royce. Okay, a little more. Mostly it is, like, whenever I ask that, it's mostly white people have never heard of them and Latinos have heard of them. So the music industry itself is very segregated. Our audiences are very segregated. But these guys were making it on the charts with bachata music, like kind of a new bachata music. And I mean, just look at that picture. Come on, how was he marketed? He was marketed as like lover boy, right? So this is one of those stereotypes that people are often like, well, it's kind of benign, you know? Yeah, it's a positive one. I'll take it. What do you think? Could there be a downside to it? This is a quiet bunch. What are you guys talking about? Uh-huh. What about what comes up for you?
Oh, I just think it's interesting. I don't know, like Enrique Iglesias
Yeah.
is a popular song, so like I can be your hero, baby.
What is? Oh yeah.
Like that plays into the whole stereotype that that's something I never heard about before.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, I will be your. Yeah, that's one of his biggest hits, huh? Good. Thank you. I love hearing this kind of stuff. I didn't think of that. Yeah, I mean, he's still on the charts too, right? He's still got some hits in him, and he wasn't on Despacito, right? No. Yeah. Yeah, they're all marketed that way, and obviously the artists are probably to a great extent consenting to that because it benefits them too. But it certainly is a reinforcing trope. That's how you either see Latino men in especially U.S. popular culture either in this stereotype, or, well, there's a long-standing history of Latino men being framed as like the bandido, you don't need no stinking badges, and the villain in a lot of early Western movies, so a really nasty character, a villain. How about, let me ask you this, can you think of any celebrities, Latino men, currently, who don't fit this stereotype, who you feel buck the system? George Lopez. Can you say any more? Uh-huh. He's definitely never framed as a sex, what do you call it, a sex symbol. Yeah, or not that I'm aware of so much. So it's a little bit more like, the comedian. Anyone else? I think that's interesting. He's definitely bucked the system. Like he has evaded these kind of boxes. It's quite amazing. I mean, maybe part of the reason no one can think of things that might just be irreticent, but it also is that there literally are not very many Latinos in our mainstream culture. There just are not. Cultural gatekeepers, corporate gatekeepers let this many through into mainstream media, right? Like sometimes I'll do an exercise where I ask students, just name any Latinas in English language mainstream media, so TV, blogs, internet, radio, movies, and we can name some, but we run out pretty quick. So there's just a general feeling of invisibility or lack of representation, and then what kind of representations are you seeing of Latinos and Latinas? Usually stereotypes, with maybe the exception of folks like George Lopez. And then, do you ever see Afro-Latinos or Latinas? That's a real invisible group. So Juno Diaz is bringing that population and that experience to light here. What else? I mean, it's not for nothing that Romeo Santos and Prince Royce are Dominicanos, right? The band Aventura made a big splash. So there was definitely this moment of heightened awareness in the last, 10 years, maybe, 8 years ago, 6, I'm not sure, when Dominicano music artists, pop artists were kind of on the radar more so in our mainstream culture. The other interesting thing that comes up, I think a lot of this is around race and gender too, is that there's this other character named Junior. And so that's Oscar's friend. And they're kind of foils to each other. They're two very different young men. And there's this thing, as I recall, Junior is often saying to Oscar, which is, you're not Dominican. You're not really Dominican. So keep that in mind too as you read. I think there's different ways to interpret that. If anyone has any, so if anyone has a chime in, please. I'll share with you my thoughts. One way is that Junior is the more prototypical. He embodies the more prototypical or even stereotypical kind of Latin lover. Like, he brags about the women he beds often, right? He has a lot of girlfriends. He has a very active sex life. The impression I get is that he's perceived as very attractive, good-looking, very straight. And he, you hear that in the way that character is developed. And so there's a way in which the novel is exploring this kind of hyper-masculinity, hyper-machismo, that's not uncommon in a lot of Latino communities, and definitely in this Dominicano community that Junot Diaz is exploring. A kind of being a man equals being hyper, macho, masculine, good lover, super heterosexual. Gayness is nowhere in that picture, right? That's the way you are a man. And so, does Oscar meet any of those criteria? No. Except he is straight. But he's not able to have the same kind of, he's not able to have the same kind of sexual relationships. So what Oscar is into, which is interesting, so this is a whole nother piece of the hybridity that I feel and detect in this world that he creates, which is this whole other subculture, which is not so clearly racialized in any way, you could argue, but it's the fanboy subculture, or like geek or nerd, I don't know. Like, people go, like, I know ComicCon is huge, right? Has anyone here ever been to ComicCon? Or you don't have to raise your hand. I mean, or maybe, yeah. It's, I mean, I feel almost sheepish saying like nerd or geek, because it's actually, seems like it's pretty vital subculture for young people today. So it's people who are into gaming, what else? Comic books, graphic novels, sci-fi fantasy. That is what Oscar loves. And that is not stereotypically macho Latino male stuff. And I would venture to say that the demographics of an event like ComicCon, Latinos and African Americans are underrepresented there. I think there is a sense, but it's changing, so that's interesting. So this is his cultural milieu, and it does not fit with a kind of hip-hop street, Dominicano kind of context. And there is, like, this movie is dated now, I understand, but it's hilarious. If you haven't seen it, it's really funny. But there is this kind of stigma associated with that subculture of, which I don't, it's a stereotype, but it's like, you don't get laid very much, right? Or you don't fit the macho mold. And so that whole movie is mining that idea that this guy is a nerd, and he's a virgin, and he's 40, right? So it's okay. Oh, you usually get out early? Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's my mistake.
Okay.
Get out of
Okay. So I'll close with this then. This is kind of bringing us back to the Fuku. I'm telling you guys, this is going to help you when you have to write about this book. So listen up. So there's Rafael Trujillo, the dictator that is basically the specter or the ghost or the demon of the novel. He's a real guy. He was a hideous human being who committed all kinds of atrocities, and he was the dictator of the Dominican Republic. And so, and the context that we're talking about here with colonialism, it's that idea that what Junot Diaz is exploring is the way that sometimes truth is stranger and more ugly than fiction, or at least as strange and ugly as fiction. So the tropes of the kind of plot points of a sci-fi fantasy novel about an evil, think about Star Wars, right? Think about Lord of the Rings, the evil overlord, and people are being thrown into pits of hell and all this kind of stuff. And he uses these these terms like demons, overlords, curses, phantoms. These are all, he's drawing from sci-fi fantasy, but he's using those tropes to reflect back on the reality of slavery, European colonialism, white supremacy, the curse of all those things. So you could kind of make that connection there. I'll leave it there. Thanks.